I have the pleasure to introduce him. I think there is no need to go into details because he already managed to introduce himself in the previous panels. Rick Fawn is from the School for International Relations at the St. Andrews University. We are here representing Scotland, Great Britain, and Slovakia, former Czechoslovakia, so the view is really from outside, while in my case it also might have been an internal view some years ago, so it's even a more complicated thing. But I'm not going to take the floor for more now. Rick, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Tomáš. I think it's very traditional for people to say how honored, how privileged they feel to be invited to speak. I have to say, absolutely, emphatically, heartfelt that I feel that. Of course, we're assembling, I shouldn't draw attention to it, we're assembling after lunch, so it's the period when people might tend to nod off or digest or both. But I would really like to stress that our conference title is 25 years of a free foreign policy. And I think absolutely essential to this, and I'm not saying it for the sake of justifying talking about a conceivably long ago period, but I really do think that the period from December '89 to 1992 were foundational periods for the foreign policy that we're talking about today. That's an essential point in itself. I also strongly suspect that that period has been heavily overlooked. Especially because of the breakup of Czechoslovakia. So an essential historical period, not just for the Czech Republic and for Slovakia, but as I'd like to argue, I think for the reconstruction of Europe. And I think there was a disproportionately large contribution to the reimagination of post-Cold War Europe that came from Czechoslovakia. So foundations were set not just for this country, and to an extent also for Slovakia, but, as I'd like to argue, for Europe. This is something we must not lose sight of. I think also when we think, as I will do, when we think of the dissident origins of that foreign policy, there is another lacuna, another thing that has been heavily overlooked. Western analysts, even the general public, certainly seized on the idea of civil society, of anti-politics, the catchphrases, as superficial as they may have been for quite deeper observation and thinking, those catchphrases neglected something else. I think dissidents in Central Europe gave a profoundly strong understanding, sometimes an understanding that was deeply lacking in Western analyses, of the strength of Soviet-type systems. But what I think was particular in the Czechoslovak case was that there was a great deal of attention in dissident circles and in dissident writings to reimagining foreign policy, to reimagining Europe, reimagining world politics, and this is before 1989. So the attention given to, let's call it domestic thinking, again, civil society, anti-politics, very much overshadowed, and it's really quite striking to me, the thinking that was done before 1989 on foreign policy. And that foreign policy thinking was put into practice. The leading figures made it absolutely clear. Havel, foremost among them, but there are many others, writing in such places as his Letní přemítání, that the thinking, the morals, the values that they espoused in dissent in the late 70s, in the 1980s, were more valid once they came into power. And that asks a very obvious but intriguing question. What are the moral trade-offs? So I think we have severe neglect of this important period, 89-92, because of the breakup of Czechoslovakia. We have another neglect that dissident thinking in this realm, which very much existed, has also been neglected. So I'd like to draw some attention to this. I'd also like to add at least one caveat, and that is that part of the title of this talk is an external, an outsider's view. And I'm not exactly sure what that would be, because I would like to think, but emphasis is on like to think, it's for you to judge, that in addressing these issues over now many years, and with the great help of people in this building, people in the very capable think tanks in Prague, the tremendous mental, intellectual open arms that I've been extended over the years, help me to think that. And I would hope very much that my own views are, in some ways, reflecting the thinking here. So I'm not sure that there can be a clean dividing line between an outsider view and an internal one, but that might be a ground for discussion. So I'm going to address the following points. I'm going to try to do them briefly. I would actually say there's a great deal, I'm sure you would agree on this, there's a great deal to say about post-communist Czechoslovak and then Czech foreign policy. But I'll restrict myself to an encapsulation of what dissident foreign policy might look like and not look like, and then look at four policy arenas. One being Germany, the second being the Soviet Union / Russia, the third being regional relations, and then the fourth being Euro-Atlantic Western institutional relations. And in doing this, I will bring up some points that bring us up to the contemporary period, and I would hope that our discussion will be fully fledged over the 25 years, including things fairly much to today. So what would it look like, this dissident thinking? To my mind, but tell me if I'm wrong, to my mind, I don't think these strands of what we could call foreign policy dissident thinking before 1989 have been drawn together. The first striking feature for me of this is that the greatest encapsulation, which we've already mentioned, that of civil society, is not foremost a feature of foreign policy. In principle, it should be, and there was a lot of talk about bringing the population into foreign policy making. But I think we only saw that to a degree much later along. So the domestic distinction is actually quite severe in this foreign policy thinking. But other dimensions that were there and continue to be there were solidarity. Solidarity both in language and in deed. The idea of helping others in need, the idea of rallying others together to advance a common point, and then also in physical solidarity. And I think this comes out in different aspects of foreign policy then and now. We hear this when we talk about support for movements well outside this region, if not closer to home, as in Ukraine. Apology and forgiveness, and I'll elaborate in a couple of cases on that. But the idea that there are historical wrongs, that they have to be addressed, as painful as they may be, but that in doing so, it creates a new foundation for relations. Legality. One of the, I think, tactical achievements of Charter 77 was still aiming to operate within the legal terms of a system with which it dissented. Legality being extremely important. And I think we've already heard many a time how, whatever we want to call them, smaller countries, countries with less resources, tend towards multilateralism. I would put a slash there and say international law. I think that dates back from dissident times, the absolute importance of the Helsinki Final Act, which continues today. I would add the idea of symbolism, both in action, and there was a great deal of that in the early period because there were so many opportunities to seize upon that, but also as a general technique to get a message across. And that's one of the ways that a relatively smaller country, a relatively less endowed country, can make a greater mark. It's again foreign policy imagination, foreign policy, if you want, drama, and I think there was a high degree of that. I think another dimension was what we could call gradualism or incrementalism, the idea that we are engaged in a longer-term struggle, that it's not necessarily a linear process, that can be backwards and forwards, and it's not going to be overnight. We have the wonderful irony, I think that's been very well documented here, how dissidents in this country, even in the early days of November 1989, were doubtful that things would happen. And they had struggled, many, as you know, went to prison many times for these views and stuck with them. The idea that you have to anticipate, if it happens quickly, great, but this is a longer-term struggle, and especially when you're trying to inculcate values abroad. It is a longer-term process. Don't necessarily anticipate fantastic, neat cutoffs and new beginnings. Something that was not in the dissident thinking, but I think is prevalent in at least one strand of the foreign policy, and it came out in a panel debate earlier today, and that is the use of force. When the foreign policy doctrine could be put into place, there was actually support, not on a random basis by any means, but under certain conditions that the use of force is legitimate, and that certain types, regimes, leaders, have to be held accountable. And that, I think, in the guise of solidarity, force could be used in certain circumstances. And this changes, I think, the view, and it was very hard, I think, for many Western analysts, Western decision makers, to see that. that these great dissidents who stayed with the idea of civil resistance, peaceful resistance, legality, even if they rejected the legal terms under which they lived, did not resort to force. And yet, when it came to the international, force could be used. And you will know, of course, that the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic have engaged in a number of military operations, as well as, of course, being good international citizens in the sense of contributing to international peacekeeping forces. So that's what I would think of, essentially, as a kind of dissident foreign policy in action. I said that I would look at 4 issue areas. I'm going to try to do this briefly. The whole point is that this will probably raise more questions than it answers. So let's look forward to that. The first issue area, if you want, Germany. I mean, of course, and Havel, among others, made it very, very clear that the Germans as people, Germany as a state, Austria, Austrians as well, had a profound influence on the Czechoslovak mindset, on the Czech mindset, on the development of the country. There was no question about that. But there were 3, I think, striking areas, at least, in relations with Germany, which showed these dissident thinkings in action. One was unification itself. I've had the privilege of being in this room a number of times. Here and in other venues, I've been stunned, as have others, how Western policymakers or those in those circles seem to have thought at the time, that is late 89, 1990, that Western governments were all happy and in favor, indeed, about German unification. They were terrified. Terrified. We now know what kinds of exchanges the British Prime Minister Thatcher and the French President Mitterrand had about this. How much of the Western media was using François Mauriac's fantastic phrase, "I love Germany so much, I'm glad that there are 2 of them." Terror. What was Havel's approach? That could be a rhetorical question. What was Havel's approach? His was, and we're celebrating now with 8,000 white balloons, the unification of Germany. I mean, this is taken for granted. It wasn't 25 or 24 and a half years ago. Havel almost stood alone among other European leaders in saying, it doesn't matter if there are 2 million Germans, but they're undemocratic, or if there are 80 million Germans and they're democratic. It's a political system. This was really quite a heretical statement. And in many regards, I was very pleased to hear in the very, very, I think, powerful speech given by Dr. Lammers yesterday morning, his recognition, his thanks to the Central Europeans for their support of German unification. I won't claim monopoly. I've gone through a lot of historical records from 1990 and somewhat beyond. I don't find generally that Germany was particularly thankful for Czechoslovak support, and I don't find that they mobilized Havel's statement. If I were in the German position, I would have mobilized it. Here's this tremendous hero who's saying absolutely nothing wrong with German unification. And in fact, the reason that Havel and the former dissidents supported the idea, and this came very much directly out of dissident thinking, the Prague Appeal of the mid-1980s, is that you could not deal with the Cold War situation without dealing with the German question. And the way to deal with the German question was to allow for, essentially, national self-determination. And of course, we think of national self-determination as fragmentation. This was a case of fusion. So Havel's support for German unification. The second, and this comes to apology and forgiveness, the statement that Havel made even before he was president of the need to apologize for the expulsion of the Sudeten Germans. And again, this came directly out of dissident thinking, tremendous debates, both verbal and written, about how to deal with the question of the transfer/expulsion and the moral implications. And again, the sense that we could not deal with injustice within our own country if we did not deal with, let's call it perceived, historical injustices more broadly. More importantly still, we couldn't deal with the division of Europe if, again, we didn't deal with unsettled macro-historical questions. We don't need to spend the time on this, but this is a phenomenally controversial measure. And I think also it was not reciprocated by, I'll say, the Germans and the German state. There are many, many different actors there. I mean, the Sudeten lobby, certain Länder, especially Bavaria. I think the apology actually inflamed Sudeten interest. It, in a way, backfired very early along in the most sensitive time of this new foreign policy. But both Havel and Dienstbier explicitly stuck with it. German, as it was often called, German colonization. The borders opened, and what happened immediately was all German investment. And by 1992, German investment was over 80% of the country. And having gone through Czechoslovak newspapers from the time, the kind of caricatures in fear that was made of this seeming German invasion. And some of the very scholarly works done that referred to this as, these are not my words, as going back, all the German executives in Prague, bars and cafes, being tantamount to what the Germans did during the Second World War. I mean, tremendous historical parallels of frightening proportions. What was the Czechoslovak response? I think a lot of alacrity, a lot of imagination again. On the one hand, some Czechoslovak figures, I think perhaps particularly the ambassador of dissident pedigree, Rita Klimova in Washington, saying this is very dangerous and so on, but others then saying, invest. If you, other Western powers, are worried about German colonization, come and invest yourselves. And diversification, I think for business reasons too, of course, not political, but for various reasons, that diversification came. So turning these kinds of questions around, not being terrified, not being hysterical of seeming historical parallels. So perhaps a mixed record on the German side, but one that was rooted deeply in dissident origins, and one where the leadership had to stick to its guns. And I think what again is incredibly striking from it is the imagination and then the political contribution to transforming Europe. The Soviet Union, come Russia. To my mind, just a personal interjection, I suspect, had I had the courage to be a dissident, had I survived the 1968 intervention, my sense of hatred towards communist rule, my sense of hatred towards the Soviet Union would be very, very high. I'll be very frank with you. And what stuns me is how the dissidents had, once they came into power, a very inclusive approach to the Soviet Union. Again, I think this attaches itself to the forgiveness side of apology, that there was an expectation of a certain apology from the Soviet Union, namely for the intervention in 1968, and that then could make relations new, that the two countries would be on an even footing. And this comes to the idea of sovereign egalitarianism, the international law dimension, that these countries would be equal even though there was tremendous disproportionality in terms of resources, and of course, the Soviet troop presence and the existence of the Warsaw Pact. And reading some of Havel's memoirs about his own personal fears about going to Moscow in February of 1990, I think shows on a personal level. I mean, he makes reference back to the reformist leadership being kidnapped and taken to Moscow and so on. What is going to happen to us? But at the same time, having the wherewithal, which this anecdote was shared with me in this building a very long time ago, and I greatly enjoyed it at the time. It's been in wider circulation since. But what did Havel, upon meeting Gorbachev in Moscow, offer him? I'm sure some of you know, but Havel, a great on a personal level fan of the United States, Havel had brought a peace pipe, given to him by Native Americans, and he offered to smoke it. You can all imagine the image of Havel smoking. He offered it to Gorbachev to smoke together. And what was Gorbachev's response? I mean, this tremendous overture. And Gorbachev's response, anybody? I don't smoke. So again, the kind of, if you want, symbolic, personal initiatives in the most difficult of circumstances. I've heard, including from some people in this room, about the negotiations for the Soviet troop withdrawal. I mean, perhaps we take it for granted today. The Soviets had no interest in withdrawing. Of course, there were huge geopolitical pressures, the idea that they would lose even more from having let the '89 revolutions happen if they didn't pull the troops out. But what was one of the arguments that the Soviets made? Kind of embarrassing, I think, for a superpower. We can't withdraw because we don't have housing for our troops at home. The Czechoslovak government's response? We'll build it for you. Again, who knows about the resourcing, but the spontaneity, the sense of dealing with the problem and not recognizing the tremendous disparities in country size and power, great imagination. And I think again, and this is telltale for now, how much the new leadership tried to include the Soviet Union, come Russia, in European structures. Be it what eventually became, and I'll put it in these blunt terms, Havel's defeat of Mitterrand's plans for Europe, be it Dean Spear's either Harvard plan, as it was sometimes called, or the Dean Spear plan, whereby Western aid, think how selfless this was, Western aid, if it was forthcoming, if Western aid was generated for the post-communist space, it shouldn't come to Central Europe, it should go to the Soviet Union, come Russia. He was still purporting this idea in '92, after the demise of the Soviet Union. The Western credits, loans, aid should come to the Soviet Union, come Russia. in order for the Soviet Union and Russia to be able to continue to buy Central European goods. And the line from Prague consistently was, we have to help the Soviet Union come Russia. Again, this idea of political value. If we help to transform them, then we get security. So none of this sense of cutting the Soviets come Russians off, in fact, a highly inclusive process. And then a few words on regional relations. And I fear, Mr. Chairman, I fear that we may elaborate on this one, and that might only be for the better. But it's here that I think we really see some of the dissident practices and thinking come together, and we see a lot of foreign policy imagination. And it's also here that we start to see the lessons that say, it's nice to experiment, but sometimes you have to recognize that experimentation means failure. No, change, do something different. But immediately, that is in January of 1990, Havel was speaking in, among other places, the Polish and Hungarian parliament, saying we have to unite, we have to use our distant era solidarity to project ourselves to the West, but we also want to work together. And it was he who convened a meeting in April of 1990 in Bratislava. And this meeting tends to be forgotten beautifully, as our chair will know very well, as a leading writer on Visegrad. This was officially founded in February of 1991 and has been celebrated officially since. But really every Slovak diplomat that I've spoken to in various contexts is A, very, very happy that I know about the April 1990 meeting, and B, they make the point that that was the birth of Visegrad in Bratislava, April 1990. And this says something, we're jumping ahead, but it says something about the beauty of Visegrad. When people make claim to something, it's a good thing. And I can see at least 3 of the 4 parties regularly making almost historical revisionist claims to founding Visegrad. That's a great thing. But the imagination started in April 1990, fantastic philosophical speech from Havel. It's a magisterial work, full of thought. I'm not sure that it's the best for a summit. You know, it wasn't a work plan. It wasn't a way of bringing Jaruzelski's Poland and the kind of hybrid late communist, reformist Hungary, plus, of course, the observers, the imagination here, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Austria, all together. And basically it didn't work. But try and try again. I mean, another meeting, I think because of other countervailing pressures, a recognition that the Soviet Union was in fact nasty. That was after the Baltic crackdowns, the lethal killings in Riga and Vilnius, that there wasn't the kind of assistance immediately from the West that was expected, but this impetus to making Visegrad cooperation. And of course it's had phenomenal ups and downs, but I think the tremendous beauty of it is its survivability. Havel, a clear architect of it, said in 1994, that it had done its job. And that's before we get into this hyper-Klaus rhetoric, which I think did a great deal to damage Visegrad, including his not sending the right level of diplomats to meetings, saying that in his dictionary Visegrad only meant CEFTA, the free trade agreement. There was no point to political cooperation, military cooperation. A lot of survivability, which we know extremely well and to this day. And that is something I think very heartening in seeing the amount of energy that's committed here and elsewhere to seeing what potential can be driven out of Visegrad. But there are other initiatives, even initiatives before that. The one that became today's Central European initiative. And think about the imagination here again. Czechoslovakia, landlocked. We all know that, except for Shakespeare's little interventions. Nowhere near the Adriatic, nowhere near the Baltic. And yet Havel had this wonderful idea of bringing Czechoslovakia into what was the expanded Alpen-Adriatic initiative of 1978. That is the groupings of Austria, Italy, Hungary, Yugoslavia, around the Alps and Adriatic region. Bring Czechoslovakia into it, which they bought. And then Havel was saying, why don't we bring Poland in too? And at the same time, initiatives developing, especially from the Swedes and the Danes, into what became the Council of the Baltic Sea States today. And Havel's great idea that Czechoslovakia could join that as well, and be this kind of bridge, if you want, between North and South. That, as we know, didn't happen. We don't have meetings of the Balts and the Central Europeans and the Southeast Europeans in that kind of format. Probably a good idea. But a recognition that not everything could work. And what I think is particularly beautiful, very unacademic word, what is particularly beautiful about Visegrad is its corruption of history. If you go to the Visegrad Castle, it's wonderful. You can see a wax mock-up of the 1335 meeting of the three kings. And it's completely ahistorical because what do you have in the same room? You have the four flags of the now 4 Visegrad countries. I mean, nobody was using those flags, and there weren't 4. So it's not historically correct, but so be it. And what was that meeting? Let me just jump ahead. The 1991 Visegrad Summit, which many of you in the room will know extremely well, spoke. It was a beautifully crafted document. It spoke about the Central Europeans being European, having had contributions to the fundamental things that make Europe. And this Central Europe being different from Western perceptions of the region, you know, that it would be free of intolerance and hatred and so on. A beautifully crafted document. And this location was used because this was the one time in history where the 3 then nations had cooperated. So an ultra-humanistic document, 1991. What was 1335, the historical precursor to this? This was, let's save time, this was a balance of power deal. Okay? It was alliance formation against the Habsburgs. It involved all kinds of politically incorrect things. An arranged marriage, money swaps, land swaps, okay? Real hard politics, nothing humanistic about it. But if you use, and we all use history, we all use it selectively, if you use history for a positive purpose, and I have no doubt that Visegrad is highly positive, then I'm all in favor. And I'm also struck because in the 14th century, we had another historical parable that was used around the same time. 1991, Visegrad in Hungary is used to create new relations in the region, to project very successfully a new image of the region to the west. That was essential. And there was another 14th century historical myth that was being used at the same time, and that was the Battle of Kosovo-Polje. And there's a Visegrad about 500 kilometers away from the other Visegrad, the Visegrad in Bosnia, which was one of the first cities to fall when the Bosnian War started. And I know which historical metaphors, no matter how they be repackaged for present purposes, I know which historical metaphor I prefer, and that's certainly the Visegrad outside Budapest. So a lot to say, I think, about regional relations. Turning to, if you want, the bigger picture, but all of these build into it, and that is Euro-Atlantic relations, if you want Western or pan-European institutions, because they all overlap. I think there is a great deal to be said here, and really the aim again will be that we'll open up to discussion very, very shortly. The influence of the dissident pedigree, I think, was enormous here. That was first recognized, I think, in the Council of Europe, partly because this was the institution that did decide to open its doors first. Not without making demands on the Central Europeans. I mean, Poland, which had, of course, led the way in 1989, the first partially, that was the problem, the partially free elections in June of 1989 put Poland in the vanguard in Eastern Europe. But that meant it hadn't had a fully free election. And in the Council of Europe's mind, that wasn't sufficient for membership. And another dissident, as foreign minister in Poland, grumbled in writing, why is it that we're not let in? And when Dienstbier came to sign the accession accords, he said, I suspect jokingly, but he said to the Secretary General, is that all that there is to it? Literally, is that all that there is to it? And in one of the official book publications of the Council of Europe, it admits that Havel's speech at Strasbourg in the early post-communist period was still ringing in everybody's ears when the Council of Europe voted to let Czechoslovakia, as the first post-communist country, in. Tremendous influence, tremendous pedigree, and in a way, lowering the guard. There's also admissions, I can point you to the source if you want, also admissions that certain oversights, which were quickly corrected, but certain oversights in terms of signing conventions hadn't been done either at that point, but credit to the country for that. And that was an important starting point, I think. Havel's contribution was important to the Council of Europe. He was quoted as saying that the Council of Europe was the moral conscience of Europe. That gave the Council of Europe tremendous sustenance. And the Council of Europe clearly became the antechamber for membership in other institutions. You had to get in there first before you had a shot of getting closer to Europe. But that brings me to another set of relations. And dare we say, It's 10 years, there's so many anniversaries. It's 10 years since the accession to the European Union. And there are people in this room whom I know very rightly say, we shouldn't be called new Europeans, we're just Europeans. I wholly sympathize with that. But let me just say this, especially to the people here, not that many, but those who have the benefit of being younger. If we think NATO and EU membership were going to happen, if we take them for granted, we're wrong. Those institutions did not want to open their doors. And better still, when finally the process began, what is it that we got? We heard very rightly this morning the slogan of back to Europe. So if you think of the revolutionary period of 1989, back to Europe, if we think of 2014, just in temporal terms, as 1989, then accession is actually something that's going to happen 15 years from now, 2029. And think of the process that was involved in making these Western institutions open their door. Think about how they, I see it this way, dragged their feet. I mean, the European community made no statement about membership. Yes, there were association agreements within a couple of years. That was very, very important. But what did they actually say about membership? That was only in 1993, 4 years on, where they said very general things. You want membership? You've got to be democratic and have minority rights protection and like market economies. To which, if I were a policymaker at that time in one of the capitals here, I would have said, we know that. And then 1997. So we're looking now, we're now 8 years on. So we're in 2022. 2022. What does the European Commission say? Well, we're willing to negotiate with some of you. Not all of you, some of you. And those that we'll negotiate with, we're going to do these very intrusive annual reports to see how you do in meeting our criteria for entry, which at that point included the 80,000 pages of the communautaire, the acquis communautaire. I mean, it's much bigger now, but to ingest international law, all that European law, among other things. And I talked to quite a number of Western diplomats who were here in the accession process, helping with the accession process, and many of them admitted, off record, they admitted that if we had to go through that kind of process, we wouldn't make it. So, on one hand, you could say, you're coming into a club, you have to meet the club's criteria, it's perfectly fine. But on the other hand, it really is to illustrate that first, there weren't open arms, and second, when those arms started opening, they were full of, and we use the term, of conditionality. But why did they open their doors? There are various reasons, and this now extends to both the EU and NATO. I would save time, and I think we can give lots of examples why this thinking is actually the case, but I think the arguments made in Central Europe, foremost, not exclusively, but foremost by Havel to those Western institutions, made those Western institutions understand and recognize their own values, and furthermore, made them act on that recognition of their own values. And this is a very, very powerful thing to do. It's really quite a stunning achievement, I think. As I said, I'd be very happy to give lots of evidence to that. If, just as one starting point, if one looks at the, if you want, generic studies of NATO and EU enlargement, that is people who are not starting with this region, but who are looking at the process generally, there's tremendous attention given to the influence, especially of Havel, to an extent of Wałęsa, other leaders from the region, but of getting these Western institutions to think differently and to act differently. So there was a huge process of change that came with that. A few final thoughts, and to draw that together, I think what you get with a dissident-type foreign policy is a tremendous amount of alacrity. Again, I use the word imagination. One of our speakers with a tremendous practitioner pedigree was speaking about how diplomats have to react. And I think it's really worth saying the circumstances in which these dissidents come policymakers were acting. If it's not too personal a thing to say, we think of Jerzy Dinsbier, who was appointed from his job as a coal stoker, who went with a borrowed suit to be sworn in as foreign minister. I mean, if ever there was a situation where foreign policy, and of the fundamental nature of that foreign policy, totally transformative foreign policy, essentially had to be made on the spur of the moment, not reacting to an email, a memo, of something that comes in, but the totality of it, these people did it. And I think that's an outstanding an outstanding achievement in itself. And I'd really like to think that in these few minutes we've reviewed this sense of transformation, of foundation laying, both for the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but also for Europe. And again, that is the positive views on German unification, on settling this question of German colonization, some high costs in Czech political terms in doing that, but nonetheless doing it. This overly favorable, you could argue, view towards the Soviet Union, which was ultimately successful. The regional relations, yes, ups and downs, but again, tremendous imagination, and a recurrent reference to the solidarity physically and mentally expressed during dissident times. There's a real pedigree there. And then I think the recreation of European institutions. And within that, phenomenal support for the CSE, come OSCE. That institution, that organization is never meant to solve everything. I think we have a misunderstanding there. But as a normative device, that's something that underlines essential values and then is able to bring those values back, dare we use the word, to other types of dissenters, other countries further east, who use a different language, use a different terminology now from that, is highly valuable as well. So to my mind, as a kind of conclusion, I think we have a fantastic pedigree in ideas, ideals, and values. It's rather unusual. I think you should cherish that. I think in many ways you need to protect it. These are things that can get washed away in the policy process. I can certainly say, stepping up back a little bit, that these can get washed away in historiography. There's a lot of revision being done of Czechoslovakia's history, a lot of play being made, especially of the Odsun, the transfer expulsion, as a deep black mark on Czechoslovak history. There's a lot that's being undone. I think it's very, very important to respect this history. I think it's very important also to deploy this history. And I was very heartened personally to hear many speakers today saying that. I'm not sure in practice we always do, but if we want to, does it sound Marxist? If we want to commodify this value, I think this tradition, this legacy is an extremely powerful one. It's an enduring one. It's essentially a cost-free one, and it should be mobilized. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick. I'm quite convinced that your thoughts would provoke a lively discussion, but before that, I'd like to use the privilege of being not only the moderator, but also a discussant, so to say. I'd like to make a few points, and very short ones. Well, first of all, your thoughts on dissident-driven foreign policy, when speaking about these two books, two titles of the books written by Jiří Dinsbier, came to my mind. The first one that appeared as a samizdat in 1986, it was Dreaming of Europe, right? And then more or less a decade after, From Reality. I think it's essential from the point of view of how the dissidents learn to actually do foreign policy and how they then faced the real challenges of foreign policy. I think this is just a remark that is to be made at the very beginning. Secondly, I think what is really essential and what also appeared in your thoughts was what has already been mentioned in the previous panels, the return to Europe phrase. I think that it was essential not only from the point of view of new policymakers in, at that time, Czechoslovakia, but it was also a nice slogan for the population, because we have to remember that after '89, foreign policy was something that was really alienated from the population of, at that time, Czechoslovakia, but to maybe lesser extent, but also to other Central European countries, not speaking about Soviet Union, of course. So this slogan, return to Europe, became very popular in the political language, but also in the public discourse, so to say. And the political elites and also dissidents use this phrase very, very frequently. This also says, this slogan, return to Europe, that you, or we at that time, the Czechoslovaks, wanted to somehow become part of the West. And it was a continuous story, because you may remember the collective work of Czech, Polish, and Hungarian intellectuals, George Konrad and Kundera and About actually the return of Central Europe to Europe, basically. This means that it was directly oriented towards the Western Europe, while forgetting a little bit the Eastern Europe. And I think that it also explains to quite a big extent why actually the Eastern policy of the first Czechoslovak government was maybe so idealistic as you described it, because I think that in contradiction to the Poles, I just like to mention Jerzy Giedroyć and Kultura, and how actually the concept of cohabitation with the Soviet, at that time, republic, we didn't have, as far as I know, anything comparable in our environment. So this may be the explanation why actually the approach was so idealistic, that we were looking mostly to the West, but didn't have that developed concept on how to behave in the new, so to say, circumstances, and how to approach our Eastern neighbors. Another point, definitely you are right, while speaking about Germany and the role that was played by the first Czechoslovak government and the reconciliation process that started at that time. However, I think from the current point of view of the Czech Republic, it might be perceived of lower importance or lesser importance, but at that time it played a role, and it was the Czechoslovak-Hungarian relations. And in contradiction to Czechoslovak-Austrian and Czechoslovak-German, I think that we didn't succeed even to initiate a debate on the reconciliation between Czechoslovakia and Hungary. This is just a complementary remark to this German case you mentioned, and it was really a successful beginning. But I think that in 1992, when it was quite clear and became quite clear that Czechoslovakia was going to split, that the Czech actually politicians were very happy to get rid of this Hungarian issue and just pass it on the Slovaks, I would say, which was quite natural because it's a direct neighbor of Slovakia, and it's not anymore the direct neighbor of the Czech Republic. Definitely, I am really thankful for your thoughts regarding regional cooperation and the Visegrad cooperation. And of course, we can just say that it underwent tops and downs, different kinds of tops and downs, and we are facing similar challenges even today, because we again hear about the existential crisis of the Visegrad cooperation, because the so-called cacophony regarding the developments in eastern Ukraine and sanctions of Russia and so on and so on. I would say that this is part of an exaggeration, and maybe we have to really have a realistic expectations from the V4, and you underline this fact very, very well. I think that it's a very symbolic, good sign that Václav Havel's bust was revealed in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. Congress, and if I remember it correctly, there are only 4 foreigners, busts of foreign foreigners in the U.S. Congress, and 2 out of these 4 are from Central Europe. We can, of course, start a debate whether Lajos Kossuth was a dissident or not, because we can actually say that yes, from a certain point of view he was, but he definitely came from this region. So we have 2 out of 4 foreigners in the US Congress coming from Central Europe, and more specifically from the Visegrad area, and I think it's not a bad record at all. Thanks. And now I'd like to open the floor to discussion or comments. Is there anyone who would like to contribute? Yes, please.
Don Baca from DePaul University and Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for being with us today. Appreciate your remarks. I'm impressed. I love that you brought up the points, especially about President Havel, Mr. Havel at the time, supporting German reunification and the importance in it not being reciprocated, at least in terms of much benefit to him or his advancement. I mean, imagining and voicing a new direction, a better and different future than anyone else ever sees at the time or is even possible, is an impressive feat all on its own, I think. But without a key transformative figure such as Havel, where do you think things would stand now at this point, even 25 years later? Who do you think would have filled the void, could have stepped into the void, filled that role? Would it have been possibly a collective of the former dissidents and reformers? Or it might have just been a void that wasn't filled, and we'd be far behind where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. I would suggest to collect more questions. So Vladimir, Vlaďa, please.
Thank you, Rick, for a very interesting and also entertaining presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. One of the questions which bothers me increasingly is that the division in Czech foreign policy stems to some extent from the division in the perception of the nation state. How important is the nation state? How important is the sovereignty of the nation state? And the discussions which we had before today actually to some extent reflected this division. Pro-European means in the sense for those who value and treasure sovereignty, rather intergovernmental cooperation for those who are more open. In this case, they accept under some conditions the supranationality, etc. So this division is linked with the attitude to nation state, and the attitude to nation state is somehow still linked to the national rebirth of 19th century and the importance of the national sort of identity and defense of the national value. So if you could elaborate a bit on this and how you perceive this. And my second point is on Havel in this context. I think that Havel was really thinking not in terms of nation state. He was really thinking in terms of common values, shared values. He was really concerned about so I would say, the human condition in the most general terms, and also his concept of human rights. And in this sense, as I understand it, at least the early Havel was not only on really the human rights in political sense. He was really thinking about the conditions, including the conditions, social conditions, the gender issues, etc. So his original concept of human rights was a very broad one, inclusive one. So, and this again is part of our debate, and we should actually come back to this Havel and discuss it. Thank you.
Rick, please.
Am I to? Yeah. Thank you very much. Some very challenging questions. I like counterfactuals myself, or the what-if questions. They can get us into dangerous ground. So the question of who instead of Havel, or what it would have looked like without Havel. So I said this is dangerous ground. I would say one thing that's striking to me is the way that dissidents in this country seem to gravitate to foreign policy making. Dissidents went elsewhere, to universities. Some decided not to be in public life. There was some variation, but there was a tremendous intensity, I think, of dissidents in this building and its connected institutions like embassies. So, excuse me, it might have been that there could have been other dissidents, and I hold somebody like Jiří Dienstbier in tremendous high regard. And there are many other names. The name of Jaroslav Šabata came up earlier today. There are a long list of other people, people of tremendous, I think, integrity, pedigree, capacity, dare I say, who could have made a mark. But of course, and I think this is part of your question, Havel is, I'll use the present tense, he's unique. There's no question about that. So we have to recognize that this is a particular historical period with a particular personality. There's no question about that. And in many ways, retrospectively, I'm thinking about how we mobilize that capacity, that value. Call it a tradition if you want. And I would like to see it there. So if we made a continuum, I suspect part of the answer to your question is the ultimate would have been that there was nothing. And I don't want to pick on other countries, but I think we could think back of countries in this region who did not have a similar personality. A personality that was known in world terms, and Havel was, through his artistic endeavors, the awards that he had received. I've been going through records from the late 70s and 80s about all of the coverage of the dissidents in this country. There was a lot of attention given to it. Not to say outright household names, but known names, certainly. And Havel was a leading name from the region. There are some countries, again, not to pick on them, who didn't have that, did not have that resonance. And I think that was part of their falling behind. We can explain how Central Europe, as in the three, or for some time the four, got so far ahead. It might have been macro-historical reasons or arguments about Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and so on. But I think it heavily comes down to political figures. Some countries in the region that simply didn't have civil society that we would have recognized. So the ultimate is backwater. The middle position would be that there were people of some international standing who could have filled some of that void, I think. Not in the same way because Havel is unique, but I think they could have filled it to some degree. And of course, there was a very strong international network. I mean, to an extent, that was true of Poland and Hungary as well, but the Czechoslovak one was very good. Remember that Clinton used to joke about the Czech Republic being the only country in the UN with 2 ambassadors, because Madeleine Albright, the US ambassador, was, of course, of Czech origin. So there were connections there. We had a discussion over dinner. I'm originally from Toronto in Canada, where there's a small but very prominent Czech community, including Samistat publications that were done by Škvarecký, Gordon Skilling, the doyen of the study of Czechoslovakia, and who gave tremendous sustenance and support to the dissident communities. That was all something that built into this. So Havel essential, but others possibly as well, and a lot of international renommee that was tapped into. And of course, I think the ethos of the revolution is, I mean, we could debate it exactly, but the epithet of velvet, which I think captured the international imagination. So thank you very much for that question. I would give a caveat, and perhaps this comes back a bit to what Tomáš was also raising. I am trying to stress that there is adaptation. It's not that the dissidents came in and said, we wrote this in 1985, and therefore it has to stick that way. There was a huge transformation, and I didn't make really a point of it. It's absolutely essential. The Havel-Dienstbier thinking was, and I'm sorry if I put it into kind of fairy tale terms, but in retrospect, that's what it sounds like, and it's meant to sound that. They were huge supporters, as I said, of Helsinki, of the embodiment, in practical terms, which was the CSCE. And their big foreign policy idea was that both the Warsaw Pact and NATO would devolve, we don't know how, they would devolve from military organizations into some sort of political organizations, and then they would, we don't know how, they would collapse into a Helsinki II. Now, you've got to start somewhere with a grand idea. You know, we had grand ideas originally that democracy is good or slavery is bad. You know, big ideas are important. We don't get anywhere without them. But this is something they had to adapt. And when Havel went to Washington in February of 1990, he gave a beautiful speech in Congress. One representative said, if I could speak like that, I could run for God. It really had a great, great impact. But Havel had meetings in the White House, and he was saying American troops should leave Europe, NATO should be disbanded. And I was talking about Havel as the great proponent of NATO, of one of the key figures that got NATO to open its doors. So what's the gap here? There's a huge learning curve. Part of that were extraneous influences. Again, a learning curve with the Soviet Union come Russia. That trust and faith given to Gorbachev, the individual, to the Soviet system, which is counterintuitive. I wouldn't think, as I said myself, that dissidents would think that way. I would come with such personal baggage, such hostility, if I had experienced what they had. And yet they had this easygoing approach. And perhaps it was because they had a stunted set of thinkings towards the East and were so focused on the West. But they adapted. And by, I mean, even in 91, certainly by 92, and clear as day in 1994, the aim is NATO membership. No question about it. So, you know, sea change. So adaptation, I think, is extremely important in there. And I mean, I absolutely agree. And I think myself of the two Dienstbier books, I mean, very tellingly, you know, dreaming about Europe and then eventually, you know, from dreams to reality. But that's good. We don't want a foreign policy thinker, practitioner, who can't adapt to realities, can't reimagine his or her own reimagination. And I think they were very good at doing that at times, and they stuck to certain cores as well. Vladimir's very difficult question about the nation state. Where do we start? In one sentence, I think Havel was a supranationalist. He was a kind of cosmopolitan thinker. I absolutely agree that his thinking about rights, about politics, was very, very broadly based. So much of his writing is about mega machinery, about the condition that modern man finds himself, the way that we are almost crushed by forces that are beyond our control, the way we're destroying the environment. Very, very broadly based thinking. There's no doubt about that. Of course, there were different strands in this country about the nation state. I would put it again in a sentence. I think that Václav Klaus, on the one hand, a great economic globalizer, or so he said, but on the other hand, I think essentially a Czech nationalist. So Havel, super-nationalist, Klaus, when you get down to it, quite a nationalist. And there was a very clear tension in that outlook. And one could say, I mean, we're getting into macro-historical debates here, but one could easily say about the region as a whole, because of the fascist experience, which was thankfully short-lived but horrifically long as it was, and of course the communist experience, that if there is a teleological development of the state, that these countries didn't have that opportunity to do it. The kind of evolution, again, if there is such a thing, the kind of evolution that Western Europe went through was bastardized, was corrupted here. And so the conception or reconception of the nation state could not happen here. And that in many ways, after '89, the reflex action was to go back to the late 19th century. I'm talking very severe national terms and exclusivist terms. So I'll confess, Vlad, I don't know how much I'm addressing this, but that would be an initial take at least.
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Sergei Yukhanov. My question is the following. I understand that that Václav Havel could have reasons, and objective reasons, to be anti-Soviet. But what is your explanation that after the democratic Russia was formed, after Yeltsin has come to power, actually in 1991, Václav Havel, during his time being president, never visited democratic Russia during all his years being the president of the Czech Republic. He was the only president of the former, so to say, Warsaw Pact countries who has never been to, with official state visit to Russia. What is your explanation? But he is being anti, so to say, Russophobe, as we call it.
Thank you for the question. Ambassador Weiss, please.
I only have one small remark. So you didn't mention the international environment connected with the drama and bloody civil war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. I guess it was one very, very important factor of creating the policy of Czechoslovak Republic and then Czech and Slovak Republic, because this experience had a huge impact on foreign policy thinking.
Thank you very much. Rick, please.
On His Excellency's question, yes, I would agree that Yugoslavia was very much present as a consideration, and I certainly know that rhetorically, I mean, we've talked about the breakup of Czechoslovakia. I mean, there was a lot of direct reference at the time to how, we think of this in retrospect, but there were a lot of statements at the time about how Czechoslovakia was an alternative model to Yugoslavia, that you can break up peaceably, so that this division was put into very good terms. I mean, Yugoslavia, I think, was also something of a dilemma for Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. I mean, we don't have time to discuss everything, but I think I was always struck at not just the division between Havel and Klaus about the NATO bombings in 1999, but between Havel and Dienstbier, who had been such close friends. They were in prison together, with Dienstbier publicly opposed and indeed taking up a UN job at the time, and Havel being a strong advocate. So I thank you for raising the point. I think, yes, Yugoslavia had a multifaceted implication in there. And what it also did, perhaps on the sidelines, was to give an opportunity to many of the Central Europeans to show their, as I refer to it, their international citizenship. That this is a conflict in Europe's doors. We want politically to try to do something. The Czechs were active in the CSCE with proposals on Yugoslavia, as they were with Karabakh, for example. They were thinking more broadly, not to mention that Havel, of course, offered to mediate in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so forth. He was thinking in very big terms. But that Yugoslavia was clearly an issue, and in terms of international citizenship, I think countries in the region really did want to make a point that they could, even though they had small armies that were being transformed, contribute to international peacekeeping. And that was a very important way, I think, of helping to convince the West that there were contributions to be made. And I think this is a footnote for now. Niches can be found. You don't, I mean, of course the Czech Republic is an underspender in NATO, but there are ways that countries can make contributions. And I think one of the ways, maybe it was a gift of geography, but one of the ways that Hungary, in a similar situation, really impressed itself upon NATO was the use of its air base in southern Hungary for NATO operations in former Yugoslavia, to the point that the then US ambassador in Hungary made the following phrase, and this was in the early accession period, 1996, saying, it's not so much that Hungary wants to join NATO, but that NATO is joining Hungary. So there are ways that these countries could act on these conflicts, not settling them by any means, but making contributions which also showed their commitment to Western systems and also to international norms. The Russian question, I'd be interested in feedback here too. I mean, I would reiterate that Havel went almost immediately to Moscow, the then Soviet Moscow, and to my knowledge, this is an open question, the only thing I think I've ever read that's truly Russophobic of Havel, and he says it in jest, was his comment about drivers in Moscow. But if others have footnotes to add, I would. I don't have a specific explanation as to why he didn't go to Moscow. There may be others in the room who did. I wouldn't say that the Czech Republic had an anti-Russian policy. We could debate different aspects of that. I mean, I would say that the Czech Republic, as did some of the Baltic and other Central European countries, gave some sustenance, for example, to the Chechens. So you could construe that as something that might be anti-Moscow, but I don't think it was an outright policy in any way.
No, the policy in Russia, there is an impression that the policy was not anti-Russian, the Czech policy, but the attitude of Václav Havel personally was anti-Russian.
I'd invite comments from the floor on that if there are any. So thank you very much for raising that.
We still have some time for comments and additional questions. Are there any? If not at the moment, yes, please.
What is better, in diplomatic and in the European Union, or represent this each country, political oligarchy or experts? What is better? The Sir Professor Fletcher told that it's better expert than political oligarchy, that each state, left politic, right politic, are in conflict. And when some politic is representing such institution, for example, Union Nation, are also in conflict. They represent individual opinion. What do you mean, Sir Professor, what is better? Thank you.
Excuse me, could you please repeat the question, because I'm not sure that... Or in Czech language, maybe.
Yeah, please, what is better in politics, in a global organization, for example, SEC, SR Union Nation, Euro Parliament, expert or political oligarchy? Or what is...
Do experts know better than politicians? Is that
yes.
Well, I would hope our ideal is that we have a good synergy between them. And that they're not completely divided. I mean, I know and see here that the Czech Republic has quite a lot of interchange. And I think the ideal is to have something of a revolving door between the two. And I think some countries are much more adept at doing that than others. I wouldn't want to have a fierce dividing line between experts, whatever they are, experts and politicians.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, the very last one.
Some other from...
Okay. I'd like to have one, if
okay,
I may. The final one, yes.
Yes, I bojím, but okay, go ahead.
No. It's a hypothetical, maybe, question too, because all those things happen in a very specific historical momentum, right? Very specific group of people, which will not repeat again. So to what extent is this experience transferable, from your point of view, to other regions, maybe?
Thank you, Tomáš. I mean, that is the quintessential question. As I was saying, I mean, it is specific, or arguably it's specific personalities, arguably a specific historical period. But that said, I think there are lessons that can be drawn. I think there are almost universalizing lessons that can be drawn. And that includes in foreign policy thinking and foreign policy practice. So there's still a lot that can be gained. I think there's a lot, and this is very, very important, that can be still mobilized. We've talked at various junctures today about legacies, the importance of legacies. There's a fantastic legacy. Use it here. And we've also heard here, and you will know, I will know, that Visegrad as well is called upon, perhaps it's just shopping expeditions, but it's called upon by many of these regions now in revolution. Give us your experience. How did you make the transition? And I know, you know, that countries in this region, organizations in this region, are reaching back with that. So at least a partial answer to your question is, I think there is some exportability. There's certainly, not necessarily a global, but there's a wider interest in this. And I think there's a huge resonance. Now, I mean, historical episodes don't repeat themselves exactly. They don't. But the parallels that were made, particularly I think in the region between '89 and the so-called Arab Spring, are very, very important. And ideas can influence. So I think that there's a lot that lives on at the same time. Yes, one specific historical period and set of actors, but still legacies and lessons. So.
Well, with this, I'd like to close this specific Scottish-Slovak panel, and I'd like to thank you very much for your very inspiring and exhaustive, not exhausting, presentation. Thank you very much, Rick.
It's very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention. And we are going to have a break, a half-an-hour break.